Hello, and welcome to Movies We Dig, the podcast about film, antiquity, and everything in between. I'm Colin McCormick.
I'm Elijah Fleming.
And I'm Christy Vogler.
And today we're exploring The Lost City of Zed, a 2016 American biopic written and directed by James Gray, based on a 2009 book of the same name by David Grann, and starring Charlie Hunnam, Robert Pattinson, Sienna Miller, and Tom Holland. And helping us uncover the hashtag real archaeology of this film is Flint Dibble, which we're very excited to have on the show. Ancient historian, archaeological scientist who shares on his platform Archaeology and is working to fight disinformation about ancient civilizations, real or imagined. Flint right now is collaborating with ongoing research projects at the Athenian Agora in Athens, Azoria and Knossos on Crete, Joramondi and Evia, history in Romania, and he is currently teaching at Cardiff University. So joining us from the UK, welcome Flint. Glad to have you on the show.
Hello, thanks. It's great to be here as well and talk a bit about movies and archaeology, two things I like.
Fantastic. So we usually start with our guests, and we'll kick it off to you, Flint, which is, what's your experience with Lost City of Zed, and do you dig this film?
So my experience, you mean like when did I first see it, or like what do you mean? I first saw it, I guess it was like 3 or 4 years ago. It was on Netflix or something like that, and me and Yoni watched it, and I think I actually fell asleep during it, and then I rewatched it last night, and so the answer whether I dig it, I think, shows up there. I found it to be a little overlong, and it's just my own personal thing. I'm not really into TV and movies that are set in the late British Empire. I don't know, like I find that period to be, it just creates these costume dramas that are kind of long-winded with their speeches and their pageantry, and it's not my kind of film in that sense. And I think it's mostly that makes it boring, is that kind of late British Empire setting. And then not nearly enough archaeology, let's be honest.
Right.
But it was very useful for me to rewatch this because I'm writing a book on Atlantis. And as you know, I was on Joe Rogan debating Graham Hancock about Atlantis and lost cities. And so I've been planning out a section on Percy Fawcett and the Lost City of Z for my book, Lost City of Zed.
We could have on our show notes like parentheses ED next to Z to keep ourselves honest about that as Americans who say Z and not Zed. But.
Exactly. And so rewatching it and then doing some reading on it was very useful because I hope we can get into, the whole Lost City of Zed in many ways has its origins as a kind of Atlantis civilization. And so there's a lot of overlap between Graham Hancock and between Ignatius Donnelly and between all these various strands of lost civilization narratives that this narrative has, that this story has. Though I will say the movie did a shit job with that. It really did not portray. It's mostly, I don't know how much the audience knows about the movie and whatnot, or how much you guys have done your research, but I mean it's mostly a realistic movie. It's based off of a book that was written about 10 years, so the 2005 or something like that. I think it was written by David Grann. Okay, 2009 by David Grann, was it? And that's a really well-researched book. I actually read a good chunk of it in the last few days, and it's very well-researched, it's very accurate, it's up-to-date, and the movie being based off of that is therefore, for the most part, fairly accurate, except with this weird connection with pseudo-archaeology, which they just cut out and make Percy Fawcett into like this progressive scientist type, which he's not.
That was one of my main questions I have in my notes about, and we'll get to that. But before we launch down that avenue, I guess Eli, how about you? Any thoughts on Zed?
Yeah, so
She took a dinner break while watching.
I did. I took a dinner break while watching this last night.
I also watched this in 2 parts too. I think that's testament to what you're saying about the pacing and the length of the film.
Yeah, it was long. It was quite long. I remember pausing it at one point thinking, how far into this am I? And I was not even halfway through.
Yeah.
And so I do not really dig this movie. I knew that it existed when it came out. I had never watched it until last night. And I woke up in the middle of the night mad about it. Like, I'm still mad. I don't know what was this movie trying to say or do, or what was the point? And especially with that ending, I just, I don't know. I have so many problems, and I feel like I'm going to need help to like articulate them. So I'm excited to hear some more from you guys, because I feel just mad right now.
Yeah. I also watched it for the first time last night. Again, have heard about it in the background. I am glad. So my very first guest appearance on this show originally was to talk about The Dig, which was more concise.
Yeah.
Starred Ray Fiennes, and it was pretty enjoyable. It was a really similar ilk too, of like you have a dig happening, but also World War II happening at the same time. And the major enemy is the British Museum in that one. Versus, I guess it feels a lot of the same in this, right? Like your worst enemy is institutions that don't believe what you have to say.
The RGS,
Yeah. There's some aspects I did enjoy in terms of like, I liked that it was kind of an early exploration of the discipline of archaeology, in terms of like, it did a good job to me of showing just how political and like had colonial motivations to begin with. Like the very first mission Fawcett goes out on is to map a border between two countries so that peace can be maintained. And that is in fact what a lot of archaeology had been used for, was to map locations and make these kind of colonial claims over space in a lot of ways. And I think we don't always focus on that in archaeology, that it's very political in certain ways. And that's just archaeology itself, not necessarily bringing pseudo-archaeology into it. So I liked that was kind of being presented. But then the ending, which won't go into too much, but it's like, it definitely, I think is the insidious aspect of this movie. It does allow for this open-ended idea of, oh, there is a lost civilization out there, maybe, with the compass. So I'm sure we'll talk about that some more.
Yeah. And also like the closing title cards.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So it could lead people down a path. Like, and it's just ambiguous enough that you could fall down like a pseudo-archaeology wormhole instead of an archaeology wormhole at the end, depending on where you're getting your information from. The one other part I liked is, like, for me, it really highlighted how archaeology is part of anthropology as a whole. Like, it kind of showed how necessary it was to work with indigenous descendant groups in order to actually get at the history of these locations, because I feel like other movies often erase the indigenous descendant cultures, or they literally only attack. And this one was actually showing, oh no, there's things we can actually learn from these people, and look how much these modern populations have actually advanced and adapted to their environment. The line of like the green desert, the fact that all of these white men can figure out how to get food for themselves in the Amazon rainforest it's just so hard to believe, and they don't think it's possible, and yet they recognize there's all these tribes living there, functioning there, and it never dawns on them as like, wait, there must be a way to survive here that we're just not figuring out. So I thought there was some good stuff, but I think the ending really messed it up in a lot of ways.
Yeah, if I could just jump in. One of the things that I did while researching behind the movie as well is I realized just how much some of the good that you're describing is the movie's attempt to sanitize some of this history. And so they really portray Percy Jackson as a lot less racist than he was, for example. And while he was famous for collaborating with indigenous groups in the Amazon, what he was keen on believing were stories about lost white tribes and stuff like that.
Yep.
And so, you know, and even the ending where, you know, the first time I saw the movie, I swear, I was tricked by the movie. I was like, wait, maybe some of these new findings in Brazil, which I hope we'll have a chance to go into a little bit, maybe they do prove that Percy Jackson was onto something. But now that I've actually done research and know what like Percy Fawcett. Percy Fawcett actually described about this lost city of Zed, the civilization of Zed. None of these new finds have anything to do with what he's saying. And so, you know, it's all so sanitized to make him look more heroic, more just, and more right than he gets any credit for being.
Yeah.
This was my big kind of sticking point with the film, where the other thing I was most reminded of as I was watching it was The Greatest Showman. For the reason, because like I remember when I first watched Greatest Showman, the entire time in the back of my head is that movie portrays Ringling as like champion of the downtrodden and the outcast. And then the whole time in the back of my mind, I'm like, wasn't Ringling like exploiting these people? And like this whole circus is like kind of deeply unethical, or like it's not this, progressive, like uplifting force that the movie sort of makes it out to be. And I was sort of thinking about that. And like my first big note in my sort of show notes as I was watching, I'm like, is this making out Fawcett to be more progressive and enlightened than he actually was? And even at the expense of like the way the RGS is characterized, where like he says like, I found pottery in the jungle, and everybody's like, impossible. And I'm like, even in their most sort of like hierarchical and elitist and racist sort of form, would even an institution like the RGS just like outright dismiss that like Amazonian tribes have pottery? Or
actually, it's kind of interesting. No, it was actually Fawcett. Fawcett himself was not very interested in the pottery. So David Anderson has a good article on the lost city of Zed and some of its...
Friend of the show, David S. Anderson.
Yeah, for sure. And so he has a great article which tells a lot there, and it goes into kind of the artifactual evidence that Fawcett used to build his case. And one of the clear things was he was showed pottery. A lot of indigenous tribes showed him pottery, but he really didn't care too much about it. Instead, he was more interested in like fake antiquities or things with unknown provenances that had Greek characters on it and weird, mysterious sigils and stuff like that. So the pottery, he was the one dismissing the pots and pans. And so like...
I loved that scene. I'm sorry. Pots and pans.
Pots and pans.
Well, yeah. And then you get, I need to look up the actor's name because it's Dudley.
It is Dudley.
Yeah. Harry Melling, that's his name. Yeah, before we move on, just for our listeners' benefit, in case you haven't seen Lost City of Zed, although it is, I think, still on Amazon.
Yeah,
but the plot is it follows a 20th century British explorer named Percy Fawcett, who goes into the Amazon first on a mapping expedition and then to uncover what he thinks is a lost civilization or an ancient city. He is sort of ridiculed by the establishment, who in the movie sort of presentation, the RGS, the Royal Geographic Society, views these indigenous populations as sort of savages, where Fawcett is sort of championing that they could be building cities and roads and things like that. And so he makes several trips with his expedition partners like Robert Pattinson and then eventually his son until his final disappearance in, I believe, 1925.
I was going to say, I'm glad you said Robert Pattinson and not like his
Henry
character's
Costin.
Yeah. Because then we just go back to Twilight lore and it's like, what was Edward doing?
Yeah, what was Edward doing? Edward was canonically born in like 1907 or something.
Yeah.
So. The age, it lines up.
No. So I think this reminded me a lot of like the stories of the mound builders in more Northern American lore, and how so many early, very British, very colonialist, or very American archaeological surveys would say, wow, this is really cool, or wow, look how incredible these structures are. They must have taken so much ingenuity, so they couldn't possibly have been made by the people who are living here now. And I kept like looking for that in this movie, and it doesn't really exist. And even the stuff that they get to that is archaeology is like was it like a statue, like a face in a tree? And little, I don't know, something in that.
I guess, what was Percy like hoping to find, right? Was he looking for like another Machu Picchu or something like that? Or like a whole fully formed out city?
So he kind of describes some of this, his son, Brian Fawcett, publishes like his memoirs in a sense, and it includes some diaries and things like that. And that was published in 1953 and then republished, I guess, about a decade ago or so. And so a lot of the evidence that Gran took to write his book, which, let's get the title of that, The Lost City of Zed, and then it's like the obsession of Percy Fawcett.
Yeah, he talks about the
and
obsession.
So it's in this kind of memoir that we get the sense of what Percy Fawcett was hoping to find. And some of it is based off of, so I don't know, a lot of what will probably revolve around is that pots and pans scene, right? So in that pots and pans scene, it's such a key scene because it's right 40 minutes in or so, 50 minutes in, and right there, Fawcett is presenting his evidence. And so he has that pottery. He describes what he saw, I guess, you know, the carvings in the trees and whatnot. And then he tries to say there's some grand lost civilization. And then his wife, Nina, had found this document at Trinity College Dublin, which described these early Portuguese explorers. So I guess apparently that earlier description, it's not actually from Trinity College Dublin. There was an old document in Brazilian government archives that Fawcett had found. And here there were 10 Portuguese explorers in the 18th century. They spent 10 years wandering around the Amazon looking for gold and silver mines and failed. And they described this massive city with like pyramids, wide streets, plazas, multi-story houses, carved inscriptions. And they even described this statue of like a young beardless man with a laurel and with characters and inscription around it in ancient Greek style writing. And so it's very much an Atlantis style picture. And this is why we can't, like the end of the movie, and it connects it to the real archaeology that has been discovered in the last 20 years. And it's like, no, it's total BS because none of these things are there. There's no pyramids in the Amazon. Right, that's further north. There's no writing there, and so there's none of this kind of stuff. But that's what he was expecting to find, in a sense, is this kind of grand Atlantis style picture of something. Yeah,
I guess like a foil that I was reminded of in the movie is like at some point on one of his expeditions, they mentioned Hiram Bingham and Machu Picchu in Peru, where like, you know, at some level, like the Incans were right, you know, I mean, in the shrink the geography a little bit, but they're in the vicinity and, you know, like clearly have like complex cities and roads and all that kind of stuff. So I guess it's like not a huge stretch to maybe imagine that something could have existed in the Amazon basin, but I don't know. But yeah, like that seems to be like, to me, like an important foil for like that Fawcett was trying to kind of find like another Incan civilization.
Yeah. I thought that whole scenario was really interesting too, because when I taught like a world history course, we looked at Cortez's letters, and this movie was really interesting to think about. It's like with only about 400 years that had passed since the conquistadors originally explored some of these regions, so much knowledge of the cultures that had been present there were already lost, which I thought was the fact that you're rediscovering Machu Picchu when it's like, oh, that was another scene that I kind of loved, is when they got to the head of the rivers, like we're the first ones here ever. And I'm like, that incorrect, but that is exactly what you would probably say. Yes. And yeah, I was just gonna say, it's interesting how like these regions keep having to be rediscovered by European powers while like not acknowledging the existence of the people who are there currently.
Yeah.
Or just like to bring it back to, you mentioned Cortez's letters, who is writing back to Spain with a certain political agenda to sort of legitimize and fund his expedition. Like that Fawcett is just going to take an 18th century Portuguese account at face value.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On the other hand, he also took at face value the descriptions of Francisco Orellano from the 16th century, who was one of the first to explore that region. And those accounts actually now seem to be reasonably correct. They described an Amazon filled with large groups of people who were living healthy existence. And disease, of course, is what decimated indigenous populations. And so in that sense, there was a complex civilization living in the Amazon, if you will. It's just it was 400 or 500 years ago, and it was, you know, it was people whose ancestors are still around today, and so, you know, in that sense, there was value in trusting some of those first accounts, if you see what I mean, and then before it gets all crazy and turned into this lost civilization kind of jazz about something that's, you know, rewriting history, if you will. You know,
yeah. It's kind of like reading Herodotus, right? Like
in so many ways, yeah. But like, I think about how we define a civilization, and for so much of like the British Empire, it would be the plazas and the gold
cities and
and
roads,
the buildings and the cities and the roads. And that's not quite how all civilizations have kind of shown up archaeologically. Because, yeah, I like Flint that you brought up that there was a lot of people living here and doing very well and existing in, you know, this great big space, but they didn't necessarily need plazas or major roads in the way that maybe a British person would see a road. And so, yeah, they were still having a successful civilization and working with what they had in their own environment. And I think our definition of civilization is so narrow. And I think it still is so narrow.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't like the word at all. I mean, the word itself is it implies there's a distinction between civilized and uncivilized,
right?
Which immediately creates that othering. And so, I mean, you know, I can't think of much 21st century archaeology where we really rely upon using the term civilization in any concrete way. We could just use society, which is what I generally prefer to use because it doesn't have that connotation of civilized and savage or barbaric.
Yeah, I think civilization also has this connotation of like a sedentary lifestyle because there are some very successful cultural groups that live a more migrant lifestyle. So like there are some groups, I know the Pacific Northwest in California, they don't produce pottery because if you're moving around a lot, pottery is not as useful as basketry or something else.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't understand those cultures if we keep having this framework of all roads lead to somewhere.
Well, yeah, I mean, it seems to me like an effect or a realization of just kind of like the sort of history of maybe just the discipline of like history and archaeology, with starting with the Near East or Europe or the Eastern Mediterranean and like the city states and using that as a template and then expecting to look for that elsewhere, that all sort of societies are going to follow that same kind of model of like agricultural urbanization and then increasingly complexifying sort of, you know, civic life or things like that. But yeah, like the emphasis on the city, I feel like is really is the fallacy, right? That we're talking about, that like to be civilized is to have a city and vice versa.
Yeah, and that's kind of reflected in this movie, both with the pottery, but the other scene is like you finally get away from the river's edge and the jungle and you get into this village for the first time and they're growing maize in lines, right? And I think Robert Pattinson's Costin makes the comments like it's almost mathematical in its precision. And like, yeah, again, this idea of like straight lines are the evidence of
which is interesting because this is actually, I think, a real story from Fawcett's memoirs, and it's a good example of some of the good he did, because he demonstrated that the further away you get from the river, you find groups that are still living. They're very populous and healthy. And so I guess this group, I forget the name of what they were, but they had thousands of people living there, and they were growing maize and a range of other plants and stuff like that, and they made friends with them, Fawcett and his team. And so it was a key finding, I guess, for ethnography at the time, saying, hey, there's people living like this right now in plenty, let's say, or in comfortable situations in the depths of the rainforest. And so so that was a positive, let's say, of some of what he did.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious also now to read the book. Is it Gran? David Gran.
Grann.
Because Flint, you said you've read some of it. Does the book portray Percy Fawcett more accurately, or are we still kind of almost heroicizing the explorer and his obsession, or do we get a little bit more nuance in the book?
There's a lot more nuance. For example, very early on, the connection of Percy Fawcett's spiritualism with theosophy, which is where a lot of these Atlantis ideas from Madame Blavatsky come from. That is introduced. His brother actually was while he was living in Sri Lanka, where I think the movie starts, his brother was in India and actually helped Madame Blavatsky write her major book, The Secret Doctrine. So he was really close to Blavatsky, his brother. And so he was very much influenced by that spiritualism. And you can see this in the scene in World War I where that Russian psychic comes in. So Percy Fawcett in real life approaches several psychics, including to read one of these artifacts that he had made of black basalt, where the psychic actually said it came from a civilization that was destroyed under the waves. It was very much an Atlantis type thing. And so that's all part and parcel here. And this idea of this being a lost civilization of white Indians is another big thing. And the book goes into a bunch of depth on Fawcett's colonialist and racist sort of points of view. I have some quotes here. So, for example, Fawcett was deeply influenced by such ideas. This is in chapter 14. His writings are rife with images of Indians as, quote, jolly children and, quote, ape-like savages. When he first saw an Indian cry, he expressed befuddlement, sure that physiologically Indians had to be stoic. And so, you know,
the noble savage
was
put across in this film.
Yeah, I think, and so that in many ways, while he was great at learning languages of indigenous tribes and befriending them, which he did very well. In fact, we can get into why the ending of the movie doesn't seem to match descriptions of who Fawcett was, because he wouldn't have ran away. He would have actually just approached hands up and stuff like that. But at the same time, he clearly had these kind of derogatory attitudes, and he believed pretty much any white Indian tale you could imagine about the Toltecs and about others. And he very much believed that the more advanced groups were fairer and skinned, had redder eyes, and all this kind of stuff. And so redder hair, and bluer eyes. And
that's so wild.
And then there's a fun description near the end of the book in chapter 24, so the second to last chapter, right at the end of it. And it's from the description of Fawcett's son, Brian Fawcett, who published the memoirs and stuff like that. And I guess Brian went to Amazon to try to look after where his dad had gone and stuff like that. And so in one situation, he's in a plane, and Brian, he wrote that they saw a distant ridge, this crumbling city with streets and towers and pyramids. And the pilot goes, "That looks like it." And as the plane gets closer, they realize it was simply an outcropping of freakishly eroded sandstone. Quote, "The illusion was remarkable, almost unbelievable." And then the paragraph ends. This is the end of the chapter. And it talks about how Brian starts questioning some of Percy's beliefs in this lost civilization. And so it says, Brian started questioning some of the strange papers that he had found among his father's collection and never divulged. Originally, Fawcett had described Zed in strictly scientific terms and with caution, saying, "I do not assume the city is either large or rich." But by 1924, Fawcett had filled his papers with reams of delirious writings about the end of the world and about a mystical Atlantean kingdom, which resembled the Garden of Eden. Zed was transformed into, quote, "the cradle of all civilizations," which is a very theosophic point of view, and the center of one of Blavatsky's white lodges, where a group of higher spiritual beings helped to direct the fate of the universe. Fawcett hoped to discover a white lodge that had been there since, quote, "the time of Atlantis," and to attain transcendence. Brian wrote in his diary, quote, "Was Daddy's whole conception of Zed a spiritual objective and the meaning of reaching it a religious allegory? Was it possible that 3 lives had been lost for an objective that had never existed?" Fawcett himself had scribbled in a letter to a friend, "Those whom the gods intend to destroy, they first make mad." And so, you can almost see Fawcett's own son start to realize, this is really all caught up in that kind of, early 20th century spirituality that was existing. And
I don't want to like overstate this or like armchair analyze anyone, but like the World War I of this all, I feel like feels very key to this, that like his sort of attitudes about the lost city pre and post serving in the war, whatever sort of he experienced. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I agree, Colin. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's kind of a reaction that's not unusual at all, right? It's this idea, like in Hesiod, it's like there was a golden age where everything was great and wonderful. And if only we could go back to that time. And that's where archaeology gets interesting, right? It's playing with time in terms of thinking about the way people used to live. And if you imagine you're discovering because it wasn't necessarily just a city, it was in some ways, at least in the film, a civilization, right? A civilization that got frozen in time. Who wouldn't want to find that and live in that?
Yeah, is it really a search for the Garden of Eden or something like that,
Yeah,
or like
yeah,
it's aspirational? Yeah. I mean, I guess that's a question for you all, like practicing archaeologists, of like, like how aspiration and like what you hope society or people or history or something looks like versus what we encounter.
Yeah, I think there's always things that we would love to be able to say about our data. And we would love to be able to point to something really specific and have a really clear-cut answer. But that's not archaeology in so many aspects. It is rare that you can find something that is so straightforward, and people still argue about, tiny little minuscule discrepancies in data, or coordinates of places, or how many bricks we pulled out of this pit, or anything like that. And so I think so much of it can be colored by what we want to see in it. And that can be both a good and bad thing, because it can lead us to a lot of really interesting possibilities that, oh, I never thought about this before, or, oh, wouldn't it be really cool if it was something like this? But I think we all need to remember that we're never going to have the exact right answer. And we can get close, but despite what we want to see, we're never going to have the exact right answer.
Yeah, I echo that in a lot of ways, because, a lot of my research is looking at the history of women in medicine. And like so much of that, I don't care so much about medicine. I just care about like, what were women doing to be successful in a very patriarchal society at the time? And can that be idealized too much? Like, am I looking for the like boss woman of ancient Rome?
Yeah.
Probably.
And yeah, like that's how much of the research is for ourselves and understanding our sense of self, and how much is to like, no, we really want to objectively show the past based on what evidence we have. And it's a really fine line, because half the fun of digging, because digging is actually really boring, is just imagining what could all of this mean while I'm in a hole with 90-degree weather and bugs,
and scorpions, and whatever. Yeah.
I mean, I hear you, but at the same time, I think there's a way that scholars have worked to make sure that the ways that we are approaching the past is ways that are grounded in actual evidence, right? Mm-hmm. And so, you're actually looking at real medical texts that describe women, and you're extrapolating from there. Now, there's certainly room to argue that maybe some of the extrapolation and interpretation you're doing has issues, but it's certainly grounded in real evidence. While, if you start looking at a lot of Percy Fawcett's actual descriptions of what he expected to find, it's very clearly not grounded in those pottery sherds, right?
No.
And now that we actually have much more evidence for the archaeology of the specific region he was in, Mato Grosso, which is where, they mentioned Michael Heckenberger in the film at the end, and in the book as well, he's brought up, and others since have done more exploration there. We now know what these cultures looked like in those regions, and they look nothing like what Percy Fawcett was describing. And so in that sense, it's clear that he was not basing this off of evidence. He was basing it entirely off of these modern myths of what a lost civilization should look like, which comes from that whole Atlantis sort of ideal, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways,
feel like this. Oh, go for it, Flint.
I was just going to go back to something you mentioned earlier, Elijah, which was the mound builders. And what's interesting is this is nothing like that, because the mound builders, we actually have the mounds. They're visible.
There are mounds.
Yeah, there's mounds there. They're visible, and they're impressive monuments. And then people are saying, well, these indigenous people couldn't do it, so therefore it must have been white people. In this case, they make up a whole civilization and then attribute it to white people. So it's even like a step further of fantasizing, making up bullshit.
Yeah. So I think that like this vision of Percy Fawcett is like more interesting than this movie portrays. Like, I feel like they kind of have this background of like his obsession or whatever, but we don't get to that full spiritual level, right? In this movie, we don't get to his like pure, I'm going off to search for this mythical garden.
I wonder if that's like actually sort of like maybe like the movie playing it safe in some way and like sort of going for a more traditional biopic kind of formula that's like this person who was misunderstood in their time, but actually history has proven was more right than not. And I feel like Flint, you mentioned the actual archaeology. Yeah, the author. Yeah. And well, I think Grant.
I defeated Grant, and I
Grant.
become him.
Grant, that's better. We can credit Flint being Grant.
But what I was going to say is like you mentioned the archaeology happening in the region and the way like the film's end title cards very much kind of lean into like, and like modern archaeology has discovered things that can, like, I'm paraphrasing, but it basically is like modern discoveries confirmed his suspicions, which, as you were just saying, is a stretch if we're being generous.
Yeah, that's on the level of the title card from King Arthur. It's like recent archaeological discoveries, and then goes into King Arthur. I'm like, what are they talking about?
And like I said, the first time I saw the movie, I was convinced of that. Right?
Yeah.
That like actually, hey, if maybe this recent stuff in the Amazon proves Percy Fawcett maybe like, sort of correct. And it was only doing additional diving into what Fawcett actually said that I've now realized, no, the movie has completely sanitized him, made him out to be progressive, not racist, not colonialist, and like made him out to actually have real evidence for his points. And it's just like, no, he didn't have crap. I mean, obviously he gets credit for what he did. He did some cool things, but at the same time, no, this is a very much, despite the movie being so grounded in real evidence and reality, it totally missed the mark on who he was.
Yeah. And it makes me think too about like when the movie came out was 2016, I think, which like the election of Trump happened. So it's like, it's not actually a Trump factor, but it is dealing with the end of the Obama administration. And like, I remember songs or like that was the bad idea, right? That like, oh, we've conquered racism because we elected our first Black president. Yay, us.
It's over now.
To give a little timeline, like, so the book comes out in 2009. It was optioned basically kind of fairly soon. Casting and stuff starts in like 2010, although it goes on for a while. Starts filming in 2015. Comes out in 2016 or something like that. So it is this whole film, the whole production basically is a Obama era entity.
Yeah. What I thought funny was they convinced the critics. The critics love the movie. Here I have a few reviews. Like in the New York Times, Manola Dargis said the film is a lush, melancholic story of discovery and mystery. Or David Sims in The Atlantic, Gray's film is beguiling and poetic, gluing you to the screen for every minute of its languorous running time and lingering in the brain for many weeks after. And then if you go on like Rotten Tomatoes, the critic scores are like 86%. The audience scores are like 53 or something. And so, they convinced the critics, though. That's for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, the fans are probably like, needs that intermission.
I'm going to see The Brutalist tonight, which is a film that does have an intermission. But...
Wow. Okay.
Good luck with that. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that the movie is really reflective of this idea of like, actually, we still had a ton of problems in terms of race and history that felt like it did get literally whitewashed because Obama was president. And this film reflected as like, oh, look how great the discipline of archaeology and anthropology was, but then not acknowledging it's like, I bet you some of those white guys in that camp were sleeping with Native women and it might have gotten them in trouble. And it's like, you never get any of that, even though, that's often included in the writings of explorers, both all the way back to the conquistadors and more recently. Like that was just something European men liked to do, and American men, I'm sure. I guess my other big question coming into this is the relationship between Fawcett and his wife, Nina, because that was really interesting. Like, I think Andy and I have used the line of like strong, independent woman as a joke. It just kind of like, because it has a certain connotation. And then she almost said it. I'm like, is that a death flag? Like, is she going to die in childbirth while he's gone? Because that's something you say as a death flag. I couldn't figure out what you meant
when you sent us that text.
I was just like, okay, so she's pregnant. He's leaving. And she just said, it's fine. I'm a strong, independent woman. And I'm like, she's dead, right? Is she? No.
Chrissy sent us a text that just said so many death flags, and I had no idea what she meant. I thought you meant like there were actual flags and I was like, what are flags?
No, I know. I'm sorry. Technically, someone did die at the end, and it was Tom Holland and his mustache. So
I actually think this portrayal of Nina was correct. I think that she was a very strong, independent, smart woman who also wanted to join him on the expeditions. And I think she went to South America once, I read somewhere. But
and that she did really want to go. And she said that she was like capable and in good health and could read the stars and so could navigate. And she spoke a few languages herself, I think, or at least had been reading and learning. And I think how different maybe that would have been if she did come along. I think that's kind of an interesting just thought process of what that would have looked like.
I wrote at one point in my notes as I was watching, I'm like, how do you end this movie? Because what we know of Percy Fawcett is he goes into the jungle with his son and is never seen or heard from again. And then so it's all past a certain point, it's all speculation. And that seems like an interesting, considering the sort of the line this film's taking about the way it's characterizing Fawcett, ultimately that he wasn't really right, although the movie kind of makes it seem like he was more right than not. But like, how do you, like, it is a failed expedition and he does take his son into the jungle and basically gets them both killed. How are they going to handle that? And they it enters at a certain point in the movie, kind of enters into a like almost Apocalypse Now-esque kind of dream-like sequence where they're picked up by this tribe and then led off into some kind of ritual. And then just kind of, I don't know how to describe the last shot. Like,
a dark, it's at night, trail of torches leading off to some unknown location.
He has kind of a hallucination, for lack of a better word, or he's in a memory of his own wife. And so it kind of cuts, it's sort of, the movie sort of transitions into like a dream. And then you get the final scene of Nina talking to the head guy at the RGS. And then she kind of walks into like the jungle basically as well. So I don't know what to make of any of that or what you all made of that.
I hated it.
Yeah, I did not like the ending.
I really hated the ending because I agree. And I think, Flint, you brought this up earlier, is that and we have seen in this movie and like from multiple writings, like I think Henry Costin and his son later, that Percy Fawcett had a great relationship with a lot of Native groups in the area and that he was friends with a lot of them, and he seemed to want to be very nonviolent. However racist he was, he didn't want to be violent. And and it seemed just like such a huge break, even in this story, if we're thinking about this narrative of him being so successful in communicating, in having these great conversations and learning, to just suddenly being like, well, now they're going to kill us. Or something ? So it made no sense to me. And I think if there is so much speculation, if they could have done anything, if they could have, shown us in this movie any kind of variation, why did they pick this one? Why did they pick killed by Native?
I mean, that was a popular idea after he died. So I guess over 100 people died trying to find him, like in the decades afterwards.
Which is hilarious.
And so they went into that area, and in fact, there was a recent story. The book starts with it, maybe chapter 2, of this guy who goes in the 90s, and he goes in the 90s to Percy Fawcett's last known point, and he gets kidnapped by natives at that time. And so, that's like a modern recent story. So we know. But a lot of the stories suggested that potentially Percy Fawcett was killed by one native group or another. But there's no real clear things, and there's all sorts of conflicting thoughts on this from more recent stories. Like the natives say, everybody keeps saying we killed him, but we didn't, stuff like that. And then there's the craziest story is that he lived there afterwards because he found Zed and was so entranced by it. And one of them, they found a purported son of his. And so it was in the 40s, and it's reported in Time magazine in 1944. And here, let me read this to you. It's just a quick paragraph. It's called Brazil the Grandson. A popular sensation during the booming 1920s was Colonel Percy Fawcett, English explorer who, with his son Jack, tried to find the lost city of Atlantis in the Brazilian wilderness. So they already know this is the lost city of Atlantis.
Yeah.
In 1944, by the way. They disappeared. Recently, Brazilian reporter Edmar Morel returned to civilization with a ghost pale savage named Dulipe, who he claimed was Jack Fawcett's son by a Curicuro Indian woman, so the grandson of Percy Fawcett. Last week, a picture of Morel and Dulipe reached the U.S. As photographed, Dulipe has all the characteristics of an albino, a not uncommon freak among South American Indians. So basically in the 40s, somebody found an albino native and claimed this was Percy Fawcett's grandson. And then that led to all kinds of other racist portrayals. So, I mean, the amounts of legends around what happened to him, who the heck knows? I mean, I guess there's one story which was recorded by, what is Fawcett's companion? Now I'm blanking.
Costin?
Yeah.
Costin.
And so about the one time they fired guns, because Fawcett would not let them fire guns, but one time they did. And then there was one story about one time where Fawcett observed them, a cannibal group, roasting human flesh. But by and large, he was very peaceful and he was very assertive. He always walked into danger rather than running away, and always waving kind of a flag and giving gifts to de-escalate a situation. And so, it was very different from him getting captured there while running away.
Yeah.
And one last note, it wasn't just Percy and his son Jack, it was Jack's best friend as
Raleigh?
well. So there were three of them. Yeah, Raleigh.
Yeah. I know like one of the other stories mentioned was that at some point in the expedition, they lost some of the gifts that they were intending to give to the indigenous groups. And I don't know the validity of that or anything, but it's like, I kind of like this idea of all of these indigenous groups are treating Fawcett, who is racist, kindly out of decorum because, hey, you get gifts, and gifts that are unique are powerful in groups because it gives you prestige of a certain kind. And if all of a sudden you can't play the decorum aspect of it, the fact that you have dick beliefs about people is just like, oh, okay, well, you've outstayed your welcome. So it's like, I don't know that that's what happened or anything, but it is kind of interesting, an idea of how we as people put up with a lot and for the sake of decorum, for politeness and certain things. And when you can't actually uphold that system, then all of a sudden the really bad feelings that exist between people can end tragically, or as to be expected, I guess, in some ways. So I don't know where I'm going with that. It was just a random thought I had about it all. So I'm just going back to Nina real quick, because the conversation between her and Fawcett about her going and arguing is like, I've survived, and kudos to her. She survived giving birth to 3 children.
Yeah.
And being told, like, it was such an interesting juxtaposition about like this version of Fawcett purporting that like these men, these indigenous group could be equal to us. We should find out, we should do the investigation to put them on an equal footing with men, but there's this refusal to do the same for his wife in terms of identity. It's like, well, at the end of the day, women are just different enough they can't handle this. They can't do what I do. And it's so interesting because it's still tied to this idea of a biological sex, or
Right.
A biological race is a lot of what the idea was at this time, of like there are biological differences between groups of people that dictates what they are or are not capable of. And it was really interesting that the movie's like, we're going to definitely say that the races are equal, but we're also going to play up the fact that Fawcett didn't think women were really up to the task. And again, another thought. I don't know where to go with it, but I thought it was interesting at the same time.
Sure. But yeah, he says like equal in mind, but not in body or something. Yeah. So yeah, I can see that would have been a really interesting thing to lay next to a more accurate portrayal of Fawcett in his explorations of this equal but not, but like I'm equal to these like fantastical imaginary white Indians, right? And not these normal everyday Indians. So I can see that, Christy. Yeah.
That was just the random thought I had about her because she was interesting in so many ways. It was definitely like writing someone. It's like, I want to write in a strong female character into this film, but she is of no real consequence other than ultimately what she's used is to highlight Fawcett's obsession.
Yeah.
Of like not an obsession with the spiritual aspect of his discoveries, but just like, I would rather, leave my wife, leave my children for years at a time to go explore. And they really do this with Costin. Costin's like, I'm not willing to sacrifice that at this point to go with you another time. Like,
yeah.
And so that was kind of how the film was using, was highlighting the obsession of Fawcett.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Which, again, very much sanitized it in a lot of ways because a lot of people can understand. It's like, yeah, I guess I can understand leaving your wife and kids for years at a time to
frames it kind of in the beginning of his frustrations with his inability to get any sort of rank or accolades, right? Like his frustration with not being able to move up in the sort of the ranks such as it is, which is kind of what's motivating this sort of, because there's that quote about like man's reach exceeding their grasp. That seems to be the kind of thesis of the film of like him just trying to, go one step further, that kind of, and it made me wonder, I was kind of going on like this is a half-baked thought, but of like a sort of culture, I'm sort of reminded of like Republican Rome or like this early 20th century Britain, where it's a culture that encourages such like personal achievement and excellence to the extent that you're kind of inspiring people to like do kind of insane things. And sometimes they pay off and sometimes they bring people into the jungle to get themselves killed. But like, that's kind of the soup, the formula that gives birth to a Percy Fawcett type.
Yeah. Which I think brings us to the ultimate tagline of this movie. He's been rather unfortunate in his choice of ancestors.
Yes.
I felt that line on so many levels at different places of just how we treat people based on their choice of ancestors.
Ridiculous. Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
I mean, I still, like I don't really have problems with changing the history of what's going on in a movie. And I normally try to do my best to, if a movie's fun, but maybe not accurate, to not really crap on it.
Yeah.
And so I think my issue here was, one, I didn't find it very fun. And then two, at the least I want the message to say something important for our society today. And I thought, if anything, especially since it was so closely based off the book, and the book did give a clearer message of where these ideas came from and what Percy Fawcett's prejudices were, to sanitize it in that way was just sort of like, man, if you're going to make him into this hero figure, at least make it more fun.
Yeah.
I
agree.
Go the next step and make it a little more engaging, rather than it being like about, this sort of long drawn out thing where he's just obsessed with being right. And
this is also like the problem with biopics or biographical kinds of films is that, and I'm thinking in this because I'm about to go see The Brutalist tonight, which is a completely made up story, although it is, we'll see how it ends, but it's something that feels real, even though all the actual people involved are fictional, but it's kind of rooted in a sort of truthiness. And like, you have a lot more latitude in order to work with when you're dealing with that kind of thing. Or to, again, for like the umpteenth time, cite my favorite historical film, Master and Commander, where all of the people in that are made up as far as characters, although they're rooted in some kind of truthiness, we'll call it. Whereas this, when you have like a biographical film that's based on a guy who lived, you're boxed in certain ways. And then you can kind of end up with things like where like the intent or the themes might clash with the actual events like of his life and things like you have to kind of serve two masters in a sense. or even when we reviewed Domina, this was like my big gripe with it, of like the Olivia that the show wants to be kind of runs at odds with the Olivia when like the actual sort of like plot points you got to hit in history.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
yeah, I wonder if this movie was about a fictional person, right? Or like it made up a story about a fictional explorer, would we feel differently about it rather than it being about Percy Fawcett?
It would be once again Disney's Atlantis. I think that's kind of the problem with archaeology in film at the same time, right? Like archaeology a lot of the time is boring, or it's just menial. I'm sure I'm using the wrong words.
Menial.
It's tedious. It can be.
Tedious.
Like screening sucks. Sometimes you find cool stuff, but it sucks. And like the more as we go towards like the realism of archaeology in film, so even The Dig, it's like the biggest like scariest moment is he gets buried in dirt, which can happen.
Yep.
But like that's it. That's all you get for real like tension in The Dig. And this one's got a little bit more. You have the snake. You have the piranha attack. Ooh, that was exciting.
Mm-hmm.
But like the more realistic you try to get about the field of discipline, like I gushed when he's like, "Hey, look, there's pottery here," and picking it up. Like, yeah, I too would be super excited on that part of it. But that's not going to be the same as Indiana Jones punching a Nazi in the face, right? Like we go from realistic archaeology to action adventure archaeology to what essentially is a treasure hunt in like National Treasure or Romancing the Stone, right? Like where it's just fun because we aren't actually focused on archaeology at all. We're just trying to find one cool diamond and have it be a mulligan thing. So I think biopic, but also archaeology in film, it's a struggle of balancing exciting for the entertainment purposes and realistic for the archaeologists who are watching it.
I don't know. I have all sorts of crazy stories about my time on digs. I was lost in Cairo with a Christmas tree, for example, for like hours. And like we had no idea we were left on the side of the road in the wrong neighborhood in Cairo by the taxi cab driver that told us we were right around the corner from our friend's place while we were going on Christmas Eve. And it turns out we weren't. And we discovered this, and then it turns out my friend had given us the wrong address. And so we were just, the taxi cab driver kept getting more and more upset. Or I don't know, we have all kinds of stories about it. Field injuries or there's this one student, this one undergrad, you talk about cieving being boring. I'll make cieving exciting for you. This undergrad would go to site every day with a hunting knife in his sheath. And while
I was there for this.
Yeah, okay. While cieving, the knife came out and he sliced himself open. Like, I don't know about you. I tell people all the time, if you're ever at like a dinner party with an archaeologist, ask them for some dig stories. Because I mean, I have stories about like a prostitute at the AIAs that went home with a pseudo-archaeologist. Like, I have like stories out the wazoo to tell. It's just a matter of figuring out how to get them in the context of the research, which is tough, but doable if you try to turn it into a good story. But so I hear you, but I think there's ways to still be maybe not always accurate. I don't think a film is ever meant to be accurate anyway. It's meant to feel authentic and do that in a way where you can still convey educational learning points, if you will, that are, about ethics or about people or about the discipline, while still making it adventurous and exciting and mysterious, let's say. I think that's doable. It just requires a good writer.
I argue like what the genre needs to be is a sitcom, a comedy sitcom like Scrubs or The Office, and you just add a dig site and you have like a few people who are there every single year, and then you have a new cast of undergraduates come in for every season.
All right. So like a couple of things I think about just like film and genre, and like, because I think, Christy, your point, like, I don't think this film is an action archaeology adventure. Like, it is not of a piece with, it's a dark, reflective kind of story about a man's obsession going into the jungle. And I think like there could be a version of a film like this that is lengthy dramatic character study of one person's obsession and finding it in the jungle or not finding it, which brings into like films that I think this film is kind of, the long history of sort of Hollywood films about jungle exploration, or even going to like Aguirre Wrath of God or Fitzcarraldo or something of these guys going in, or even like Heart of Darkness or something like that. Like that seems to be that's the soup we're swimming in, or Apocalypse Now. That's really like the touchstone for this. But then when you make it sort of tied into an actual living person, that brings in all of these extra complications of like, what are we doing with their legacy? How does that tie into all these actual sort of historical, these people who lived and breathed, and are we reimagining legacies? And I think a lot of the times, I mean, I generally think Hollywood should stay away from biopics, whether it's about Freddie Mercury or or Percy Fawcett or something, because like that just its sort of relationship to, we'll say, history or truth, which is a slippery thing, but like brings in these complication things that just kind of interrupt whatever the film is or is trying to be. And like, I could see a very successful version of this film that is inspired by Percy Fawcett,
sure,
but isn't actually Percy Fawcett, and thus isn't trying to resuscitate his legacy or something like that. And so we don't have to worry about the legacy of it all. But
yeah. On that note, I think you could do a more Master and Commander like vision of this story with or without a real Percy Fawcett, where it's just the jungle. Like there's no back home, there's no anyone else, there's nowhere else to be. It's just this survival story. Maybe it's their, the 1925, and it's just the three of them. And yeah, I could see that like dark character survival study of maybe they start off on a much more scientific, realistic, we want to see what's here, we want to explore, devolving maybe one or all of them into something fantastical and odd. And like, I think that would be a good story.
Yes. You just made me think of something. This kind of story would suit so well with a South American genre of magical realism.
Yes.
If they would have taken that
100 Years
kind
of
of approach.
Solitude?
Oh,
yeah, exactly. 100 Years of Solitude type
so
style.
Good.
And so like if they would have, and that was a lot of the scholarship on this movie, so I read two different articles. One is The Promise and the Lost City of Z, Diaspora's Cinematic Imperialism in Commercial Films, which compares these two films by people from similar diasporas. And then another one, which was titled, which you guys will probably like the title, Fear and Loathing in the Americas, White Fanatics and the Cinematic Colonial Mindset. And in both of these, the major complaint is like the emphasis is on like the British Empire and England, rather than and so when you're in South America, the natives and indigenous people are just window dressing. Even if like they're not doing anything super colonial or not, they're just kind of part of this weird background that creates these challenges. And so
it's an implicitly othered setting and people.
Yeah.
And in many cases, so the second article I mentioned, the White Fanatics and Cinematic Colonial Mindset, what it tried to argue is this was a period in the 2000s where movies realized they couldn't have white saviors, right? And so Percy Fawcett is not a white savior. Instead, he's this new type, which is a white fanatic, somebody who's a little obsessed, but there's still the foil, which are the magical natives, which help him along the way to solve his issues. And so, so it still falls into that trope, just it's kind of turned on its head with him as this kind of fanatic type character. So yeah, it's a real problem by focusing too much on the British perspective, and they could have done so much better.
Even just like the jungle in film is a whole thing of like the jungle is a landscape in like film history for like, it is like goes back to Heart of Darkness, which is like deeply implicated with like colonial attitudes towards basically the dark continents, air quotes, or something like that, of these places that are like a little supernatural. They're outside, they're exterior. When white explorers sort of penetrate them, it becomes this like psycho journey, into their own souls or something like that. And like that is sort of laden, like Glenn, everything you were just saying is like that has all sorts of problems and presumptions and colonialist attitudes sort of baked into it.
Yeah. It's the ultimate like man versus nature, right? And it's coming out of this long period of history of man trying, I mean, we're still doing it, right? Like control of nature.
Mm-hmm.
You could argue that's what civilization, air quotes, is all about, is just trying to control something that the jungle represents will ultimately fight back. And it's a conquering story in and of itself that way.
Yeah.
So I let's see, we're well into an hour at this point. I just wanted to check in and make sure if anyone has final thoughts. I have a question, but
I have one thing that we should talk about that we haven't gotten to yet, which is James Murray.
Yeah.
I loved this. I thought it was so funny. He was like, I went on one thing with Shackleton and I survived. Therefore, I can do anything.
So context for listeners who haven't seen the movie yet. Well, spoilers again, although we're well into it at this point. So I don't know what you're still doing here. But they're on his second expedition. Fawcett is joined by James Murray, who is a celebrity. I think he's a biologist by training, but he was an Arctic explorer with the Shackleton expedition, and he joins Percy's Amazon expedition and is just a complete liability and an absolute mess. And I wrote in my notes that if I were on this expedition, we would be having a serious conversation of shooting him and never telling anybody about it. But, thoughts on James Murray?
So from what I read, I think it was sort of a true story with everything that happened there. And it just reminds me of some students I've had on digs.
Yep.
Yes. Yep. 100%. Yes.
I'll leave it at that.
Just can't hack it.
Yeah. I can share, like, so I was a grad student who worked at Azoria in 2013, which Flint, I think you said that was the first season you were working there too. Mm-hmm. So I was at the site, and the stories of just, because this was a huge group of grads, or like of students working there. Usually a lot of the groups I work in are a lot smaller, but like I had a roommate who refused to drink water for some reason. I don't know why.
Strategy.
Something. And then there was another scenario. This involves as well.
Okay.
Let me know if we need to bleep out any names.
I don't think so. I'll just say is a very generic name. Anyway, had we called them water babies. They're just these jugs we would take of water up to the mountain, because you were stuck on the mountain all day until the dig was over. And some of us, one person still had water in theirs. This guy that I'm more making fun of, and he had a regular water bottle that was just a chunk of ice at that point, because we'd figured out you could put like your water bottles in the freezers overnight. You'd have ice. And so he had no water, but a giant chunk of ice. And this other guy had a jug of water that was like blazing hot because he's been sitting in the sun all day. And this is like, hey, why don't you put some of your water in my bottle? It will cool it down, and then we can both have cold water. And this guy just looked at us and went, germs. And I'm like, dude, we dig in goat poop all day. Now, that's funnier pre-COVID, so I'll give this guy some credit. But it was just like, we're all in the back of a truck at the end of the day, and we're all looking at this guy incredulously. I'm like, are you kidding?
Yeah, just the idea that you don't want to even share water when you are like dangerously dehydrated and could pass out is very, very silly.
And that's who Murray represents, is the one person, maybe multiple people on a dig that just make life miserable for the entire group because they are not prepared to be there.
Yeah. I've encountered lots of people that refuse to drink water, and then they get heat stroke, and it's just like, we have been encouraging you to drink water all day. We've been saying it's friggin' hot and dangerous, and now we have to take you to the hospital. What is wrong with you?
Yeah. Yep. No, I don't know. The thoughts are fleeing my head, but I feel like some undergraduates truly do not know what they're getting into. And I don't know how to like change that to impress upon undergraduates that this is incredibly difficult and you will be hot and sticky and sweaty.
Well,
and
that's the thing
that
gets me though, is not to like make light of it, is like I've had some of these, not nearly as bad, but like when leading abroad trips or things like that. But like it's not difficult to like drink water and like stay out of the sun. Like, that's actually quite easy. The basic steps you need to take to not get heat stroke or dehydrate are actually like pretty simple, but Anyway.
Are they just all sitting there? It's like Indiana. I never see Indiana Jones take a drink of water.
But he does have a knife.
Yeah.
So I need to have my knife, obviously.
Does he though? I'm pretty sure he has a pistol most of the time, which I wouldn't really want to see on a dig site either.
Right? I don't know.
Temple of Doom. He's got a machete at one point.
Fair enough. Fair enough. You do not need a machete at Azoria. I can tell you that much.
You don't need a machete at most sites.
I've had to use machetes though. Occasionally you do.
Occasionally you do. We have a scythe at Histria. We gotta, tear down some stuff.
For the weeding, right? You weed for like the first day or so.
Yeah.
A lot of tall grass that needs to go.
A lot of tall grass.
Bamboo infests places, that's gotta chop it down.
But it's not like an everyday thing.
No.
We had in Portugal the problem was the amoras, which are like these blackberry bushes, but they just grow like at an insane rate and just take over everything, and then they're covered in spines, and the goats never wanted to eat them.
When the plants have spike, it's a bad day.
Yeah.
Remember the difference between survey and excavation as well. I've surveyed some tough terrain with lots of spiky bushes where, it is not fun. And you have to chop ahead of you to get through to follow your transect, because that's what you have to do to keep your even transects. And, that's a bit like this, because you have to go through rough terrain and you just have to do it and you have to cut your way through. And, I'd say survey is probably the closest to this.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. There's still people doing surveys in very difficult terrain. I hope to have a friend on my YouTube soon. He just did a survey through, I think, the Namib Desert in Africa, and it was a 2-person trek for a week, I think. And so it's kind of like this kind of situation where you're off the grid and you have to you carry what you take with you. Though I guess Percy Fawcett learned how to live off the land a little bit, but yeah, so there is some components of this in some archaeology still, but it's not super common for most of us.
Yeah. All right, Christy, did you have something, Christy?
I have a final question, if that works. Okay. So this film is really interesting, as we've because it paints itself as real, more real than we would say of Indiana Jones. Or I would even say it's like it has the same problem Stargate has, but Stargate didn't hide the fact it was ancient aliens, right? Like, it's just coming out and being like, this is ancient aliens.
The movie did not mention Atlantis at all, which I felt was a choice.
They're similarly related, but so this is to Flint, but also to the group as a whole. Like, do we find this film to be a helpful introduction to the field of archaeology, especially if we do compare it to fictional archaeologists like Indiana Jones or films like Stargate?
To me, no. I think this film is a terrible introduction to archaeology. I actually think most of it doesn't have to do with archaeology at all. It's actually, that's rewatching it. That's what sort of shocked me, is I was like, I remembered there being more archaeology in this, and there's almost none in there. And I actually think, if anything, it does a good job not only of sanitizing Percy Fawcett, but of sanitizing the idea of a lost civilization as possible, and especially with that ending card, which we've mentioned several times, about them saying that this idea was justified and proven right recently. It hasn't, and the idea of a lost civilization is unfalsifiable, which is a problem. Meaning, you could say that there's some area of the Sahara has not been surveyed, and in fact, Fawcett does this. There's a scene in the book where he meets this French person who describes how it's right before Fawcett goes on his final expedition with his son. And the French person's like, no, I was just through that entire area. There's nothing there. And Fawcett's like, oh, come on. The area is so big. There could be a valley that somebody hasn't seen for a century nestled away there. That could be where my civilization is. And so that just makes it completely unfalsifiable. And so what it does is it really sanitizes that whole milieu of this Atlantis lost civilization thing, divorcing it from all the racism, mysticism, spirituality, B, divorcing it from all the colonialism and whatnot, C, cleaning up the figure of Fawcett's and others like him, and D, in many ways, they kind of make Fawcett into like a Graham Hancock type character, where like he has this obsession idea that he's going to prove everybody wrong, and he has solid evidence that seems tangible and whatnot, rather than the crappy evidence that he did have and that Hancock has. So I think, if anything, it's a really insidious introduction to archaeology that, by seeming so real and actually being based in so much reality, it actually does a worse job than something that's overtly fictional, if you see what I mean. So I actually think it's terrible. I think it's and it's boring.
Yes.
It's boring and long.
Yes. I completely agree. And I think, Flint, that you have articulated why this movie made me so mad and why I woke up in the night thinking about it. So, yeah, the insidiousness of making it all seem so reasonable, and just that this could be seen as an introduction to archaeology by people who are just watching it for the interest of it, and that they might never know how actually really up this history is.
Yeah. And it's a little depressing that like the book does a better job of representing Fawcett and everything. And I don't know how many people go and watch the movie and then read the book afterwards.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Da Vinci Code might be a weird exception, but still.
Just one extra thing to add. Another thing that really upset me is it used a line that I used against Graham Hancock in my debate with him, which was when Fawcett was introducing the idea of this lost civilization in front of the Royal Geographic Society, and Barclay is like, "I've been there. I know this isn't true." And Fawcett is like, "Yeah, you went there as a tourist."
Yep.
And I'm like, that's what I told Hancock, right?
Yeah.
So the reality is by archaeological standards, Fawcett is there as a tourist as well. Like, he's just tramping around, cosplaying. He's not doing any real systematic survey in any real scientific manner. In fact, his competitor, Rice, Alexander Hamilton Rice, who was organizing an expedition in the Amazon around the same time, he was using up-to-date methods like planes and other kinds of actual surveying stuff. And so Fawcett was really just this old, gentlemanly Victorian explorer, not a friggin' archaeologist, which of course is what something like Hancock is based off of, is like a Victorian explorer type thing, And they're just tourists, that's what they are.
That's such a great point to end on. I love that.
Yeah. Read the book. Don't watch the movie for once.
Yeah.
Wait. One last fun point to make.
Please do.
I just remembered that I found. So to think about like a Brazilian point of view on Fawcett. So I guess there was this one Brazilian explorer. His name was General Candido Mariano Rondon, who was the director of Indian Protection Services and an explorer as well in Brazil. I guess he tried to join up with Fawcett, and Fawcett turned him down and wanted no Brazilians on his expedition, except for like indigenous tribes that he encounters in the wild. And so he refused them. And this is for the expedition in 1920. And it was a fiasco and nothing good happened. And I guess Rondon actually started gloating about it and like bragged about how he found nothing. And it was because he didn't actually come to him for collaboration. So clearly Fawcett was more interested in his own kudos rather than sharing credit. He wanted that, he wanted to be the one who magically got in touch with native tribes that have not been contacted forever and that kind of stuff. And that's what he did a good job of getting lost, because that made his legend persist.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? Being a martyr to his cause, I think, was effective.
Sure.
Yeah. Wasn't one of his last communications also is like, if we don't come back, don't send anyone to look for us?
Yeah, exactly.
So weird. So weird.
Oh,
yeah,
I had
one
other random comment that the film seemed really weird about. Because again, one thing I liked was like, to me, this gets lost with looking at the ancient Mediterranean world. There isn't necessarily as much emphasis on like talking with indigenous or descendant communities, because they're so present and have such a strong cultural presence because they're European. I got really confused about is that for the most part, Fawcett's only ever speaking Spanish, which again is a colonizing language.
A little Portuguese here and there, but yeah.
Yeah, it's still another colonizing language. And like, we don't actually we hear the indigenous actors Supposedly nothing's translated speaking, or no, I guess it's translated a few times, but they're speaking, they're speaking native language, and you never actually see Fawcett's character do that. And I thought that was really weird and interesting that like even a modern audience can't Spanish, as far as we up here in the United States are concerned, is in fact a lesser language. We're just like, no, that's also a colonial language. And it's almost a complete erasure of the actual indigenous languages, and the fact that, I don't know, that's where I was at. I thought the use of language was weird in this film as well.
Yeah. There were a lot of weird choices for 2016.
Right.
I keep coming back to like I was looking over just now all the reviews that and a lot of reviewers that I follow and generally like, who either kind of, some of them are sort of more mid, but some of them are praising this movie. And I just wonder, like, yeah, the fact that this came out in 2016 affecting its reception. If this movie came out today, would we feel totally differently? Or at least the wider critical audience. But I don't know.
I think so, because also the arguments that Flint has had on other platforms, the presence of Ancient Apocalypse on Netflix and things like that has just brought these issues in much greater focus, and this denial of the racist ideas that do infiltrate the field of archaeology. I think true archaeologists acknowledge that history, and we work in ways to address it and overcome it. And other pseudo-archaeology just pretends it's not actually a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
See, I don't know if we'd do it so much differently today than 2017, because most of the critiques that I read of the film came out in like 2017. So, meaning like David Anderson published the whole thing about this issue with Atlantis and New Age philosophy and stuff like that, and the colonialism. That's in 2017. Same thing with the other reviews that I read. And so, I think it would be the same. I think what we'd probably still see is a bunch of film critics saying, this is masterful. It comes off as so real, and you get in the head of this guy. And probably all the scholars are still saying, yeah, this is BS, and it's promoting shitty ethics. Because I think that's, and it's one of the challenges I have, and I imagine you guys have. You're sitting here critiquing films all day. And so how do we get across to people these issues without just coming off as hoity-toity and prejudging everything as white supremacist? And, because I agree with the public. If we're only doing that, look, we live in a world where there is structural racism. So obviously everything is racist. So if we are beating a dead horse by constantly calling everything racist as well, because everything is racist. So how do we effectively make these points? I don't know. I actually try not to be so critical. I do the best I can in public settings. But with this film, I just couldn't, because it hits so close to home, which of course is why you got me on. But it's just sort of like, it's tough. I don't know. I mean, I imagine probably lots of your conversations end this way. I mean, what are your thoughts on how do we reach the public without constantly always being negative Nancy's, let's say? Like, how do we do that?
Yeah. I feel like that's why it's fun for us to get to talk about film, because it's a touchstone for more people. Like, more people are likely to have seen a movie that has some archaeology in it, like Indiana Jones. And we're like, okay, cool. You've seen it. Here's the parts we like. Here's what we think is they're doing well. And it's like, and here's the things you don't necessarily realize until you've spent a lot of time looking at it. So I think we're kind of lucky in terms of our choice of platform or our choice of topic.
Yeah, I very much feel what you said, Flint. And like, and the disclaimer is I'm not a archaeologist by training or practicing, and so I try to sort of approach these films more often, not like qua film, like think of them as sort of like not judge them by the metric, right? I don't want to judge a cat by how well it swims or something, or a fish and how well it climbs a tree. And so, like, that is, I think, like the thing that we try to get away from in the show is not to nitpick it for historical accuracies, but like, this is a film, and we didn't really do that. But of like the sort of deep underlying message, and like think about it at the macro level of like the themes and the ideas that it promotes and promulgates and things like that. And yeah, this is like, I'm trying to sort of separate and then see if I can in my brain, like, and ask myself, like, is this a well-made film? on the cinematography, the directing, and the acting. And I think probably what most of the critics are seeing is like probably on most of those metrics, like, yeah, it's well shot. It looks good. We didn't talk about Robert Pattinson at all, but he's quietly become one of my favorite actors of the last decade. Even a young Tom Holland, I think, is giving a good performance. You know, all that stuff. But I also at the same time cannot divorce it from everything we just talked about of like the inkling, the feeling in the back of my head that like I feel like even if I don't actually know, but I deeply suspect that this film is massaging this legacy, possibly with sort of troubling, radiating implications. That wasn't really an answer, but of just kind of like, yeah, like can I evaluate something as a film versus as a
story about ourselves, right?
Yeah,
at the end of the day,
I do think it is like fun to be able to do things like podcasts and like a lot of the more public facing stuff that you have done, Flint, which I think like, and I know you, like you are such a fun person to talk to. Like you have great storytelling abilities. And I think that is maybe what we need more of, to sort of have this like casual conversation. It's like we're not preaching at anybody, we're not lecturing at anybody. It's just like, no, we want to have a conversation about a movie that we watched, and or we want to have a conversation about this like freakishly wrong Netflix show. Like so I think I do appreciate just the way that you have approached so much of this, and I think more of that hopefully will be able to have us not be so hoity-toity lectury and just like, let's talk about movies. Let's talk about cool shit. Let's have fun. Let's tell stories. So I hope, and I don't know, again, if this is like an answer to the question, but I hope that that is sort of how we could reach more people and have real discussions also.
Yeah, I think storytelling's key. I mean, you guys had originally invited me on for Gladiator 2, but it didn't work out. And to be honest, I saw it, and I might be the only classical archaeologist who liked that movie. I thought it was fun. It was stupid and inaccurate on every level, but it was fun, you know? And that's where, like, with this one, if this one was just more fun, I think I could have forgiven some of the issues that we discussed. But since both times, especially the first time I saw it, I fell asleep like 2/3 through. It's like, it just wasn't fun, you know? And I think that's where we need to get a little better, is forgiving things for the sake of it being fun. While here, it seems like the decisions that they made in changing stuff was very much along the lines of intentionally sanitizing this to make it more palatable to the public and make him into more of a recognizable or relatable hero, let's say. And that, because it wasn't fun, that really just didn't come off very well in the end, because it was just like, well, okay, I agree with him. We should be treating indigenous people better. But why am I yawning while listening to this?
The joke that I started with is Amazon describes the film as sophisticated. And it was actually Andy who said this, like, what makes it sophisticated? British accents? And I'm like, yeah. And it's like, honestly, the first 10 minutes might have been the most posh thing I've seen since Bridgerton. So,
I think that's when I started dozing off, is because, it's exactly that late imperial British Empire thing with drama. And I'm just like, oh, God, I hate that. Oh, God, I can't watch this. So go out and watch The Lost City of Zed, and then afterwards tune in for more of this podcast in my YouTube channel.
For sure.
Nice.
For sure.
On that note, we can wind down. But yes, special thanks to Flint for joining us as we map out this film and gush over some pottery. But Flint, if people would like to learn more about you or your work, where can they do that?
Yeah, probably YouTube's the best place. Archaeology with Flint Dibble on YouTube. Another area I'm active is Blue Sky, but I'm sort of present on most social media, let's say, under Flint Dibble. So just look me up. But YouTube's where I'm hoping to do a lot more, and I'll try to get you guys to come on, and we can do a live stream at some point and
so
chat
fun.
about your podcast and your thoughts on some films or something. And
that'd be great.
That would be where to find me, the best place. And I want to do a lot more public-facing stuff. I think we have to tell these stories, and I think we need to do it in a way that is fun. Like what we've been hammering home. We just have to make archaeology still have those learning goals in mind that are accurate and authentic and whatnot, but we need to be fun about it and take on that role of being entertaining, because they're not going to listen to us if we're not. So, fuck that.
Yeah. Are you not entertained at the end of the day?
In the end, it all comes back to Gladiator. Finally, special thanks to all you listeners. We could not produce episodes like this without your support. That being said, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe if you like what you hear. You can find all of our episodes on movieswedig.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to know more about our upcoming plans and episode releases, be sure to follow us on social media, where you can find us under some variation of the handle @MoviesWeDig. We'll talk to you all soon. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.